Greetings, everyone, and thanks for attending today's webinar. We've got Real Story Group founder and CEO Tony Byrne on the line with us today, and he's going to walk you through the right way to select a new web content management platform. We've been at this now for 20 years, and certainly we've run into some situations where we've seen the wrong way to select one. So what we're going to do is share some insight with you on methodologies and approaches to take as you're looking to evaluate a new solution or potentially divorce from your current provider. So keep that in mind as we're going through today's session, which Tony will again take you through the heart of. But as we get started, I just wanted to mention a couple housekeeping items of note real quick. You can ask questions throughout today's session or provide us with any feedback, anecdotes, whatever you'd like, in the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. So please feel free to do that. And also, everyone will be receiving a copy of the slides from today's session. So stay tuned for that in the next couple of days. And then our subscribers on the line, you'll be able to access a recording of this presentation anytime you want in your subscriber library. So as we get started, just wanted to provide a little bit more background about Real Story Group. I do see a number of new folks on the line with us, so thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us for the first time. We are a little bit different when it comes to the analyst firms that you may be familiar with that are out there, the bigger ones with the magical quadrants and waves and such. We really don't believe in that, and thus we don't evaluate vendors that way. Rather, our approach is helping you find the solution that's going to be the right fit for what it is that you do. And we're known for taking really a pull no punches approach in detailing what these vendors do well and what they don't do so well. And with that, we never work for or advise the vendors that we cover in any way. So you can be confident that you're going to get an unbiased look at which one will be the right fit for your particular needs. So please keep that in mind as we're walking through today's session, as Tony is sure to pull no punches when detailing the marketplace and the vendors that are in it. Speaking of which, here's our famous or infamous subway map that shows the vendors that we cover. And the line that we'll be focusing on today is the blue line on web content and experience management. So with that, I'll turn things over to Tony.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Scott. I really love this topic. It's kind of near and dear to my heart. I've been tracking these firms for either using the technology now for 25 years, tracking these technologies specifically in the last 20 years. It was 20 years ago this month, actually, that I founded CMS Watch, which is the predecessor to Real Story Group. That's the logo you see in the left. And our mission in life was to provide much harder hitting evaluations of web CMS vendors, which we've been doing now for the last 20 years, and it's been fascinating watching this marketplace expand and expand, constant predictions of contraction that never really quite happened. If anything, there's been a lot of really interesting new entrants every year into this marketplace, and it's been a joy really to stay on top of it and to help many of you make good decisions around what's the right sort of technology, because you don't want to be flippant about this. This should really be kind of an anchor in your MARTECH mall, and so you really want to make the right choice. And one of the themes today is that your choices are changing going forward, and that you may want to look beyond some of the usual suspects. So with that, let's get into it. First, we're going to do, because I can't resist, and it has been 20 years, a little bit of past and future. And the reason why I'm not going to linger too much on the past, except to suggest that some vendors are still in the past. And so, before you even get started here, I'd like you to understand that a little bit. And certainly being, forewarned is forearmed. So let's go decade by decade. Here's the reference model that we had at CMS Watch for the 2000s. And so the idea here was that your web CMS was ideally designed to do some multi-channel publishing with these diverse input of data and documents and media, and then it became a library, and then an editorial workflow, and then it outputted, pages, maybe some XML syndication. Back then we called them wireless devices. And so it's this idea of your CMS is really kind of the center of your digital universe. and everything sort of revolved around it, and that worked well enough. But what's interesting is that many of the CMS tools that grew up in that era still kind of think of themselves that way. I mean, certainly Drupal comes to mind, WordPress to a lesser extent, at the server optimizedly, certainly Sitecore and others, many of the .NET players are this kind of digital ecosystem in a box, right? And I think we've kind of grown a little bit beyond that, and the vendors haven't always. In the 2010s, the issue really was about modernization and horizontal integration. So, all these other channels emerged. You see at the top a lot of sort of interaction delivery services, and then a wider panoply of content and engagement management capabilities. WCM, still an important box, but also marketing automation, social engagement, digital asset management came of age in the 2010s. We started thinking about customer data a little bit more. And the real push here was to try to sort of modernize these environments. And many web content management players, particularly the larger ones, started making acquisitions or joining up with larger vendors to try to sell you kind of a suite of services. And the idea was, well, if you buy all of these from a single vendor, you'll have a much better chance of aligning and integrating. And the data has really borne out that hasn't really been particularly successful for enterprise customers. And so, this has been kind of a challenging decade, a productive decade in as much as we've done a lot of modernization of these different layers, but also some silos have emerged as well. Unfortunately, some of the major analyst firms are having you double down on the 2010s by having this notion of a DXP. So they very often don't even mention WCM anymore. They've come up with this vendor phrase called Digital Experience Platform. And no one can really tell you what a DXP is, except it's an agglomeration of a bunch of tool sets within a single vendor. And supposedly this is supposed to be useful for you from the standpoint of actually evaluating a web content management or a digital CMS. It's not particularly, this isn't a particularly helpful chart, and in fact probably sends you to the wrong vendors. So, the good news is many of you have still clearly dramatically improved your web presence over the 2010s, and certainly many of you have modernized your web content management environment. Many of you have not, and we know from some of the new subscribers that we take on, many of you are stuck in legacy platforms. But even if you're not, we think that 2020s is going to be different. And the reason has to do with this silo problem, that we all want to have a consistent, coherent customer experiences across any prospect or customer journey, across all these different digital and non-digital touch points. The problem is that we have all these different siloed products and platforms that have their own content, their own data, their own rules, their own planning, and their own analytics. And certainly that's the case for web content management systems driving towards website. In this sort of second silo over here, is that very often a WCM will have certainly its own content, but then its own data subsystem, its own rules, personalization, its own planning capabilities, and then sometimes even its own built-in analytics. And so you understand the web world very well with that powerful platform, but you may not understand everything else that's going on. So we think there's going to be a new reference architecture, the target reference architecture for the 2020s, where a lot of core capabilities are going to be abstracted out or decoupled from these engagement platforms. In this case, decoupled from your web content management system, certainly around operations, certainly around customer data, orchestration and personalization, potentially some lower level omnichannel content, which web content management systems are not perfectly good at managing. And then certainly around analytics, reporting, and modeling, this is going to be a deeper enterprise function. So what this leads us to is a different kind of stack architecture. And you can see many of our other recorded webinars around MARTECH Stack, which will tell you a lot more detail about this. But what I wanted to point out here is that WCM has gone now in 2 decades from being kind of the center of your digital ecosystem to kind of a key anchor in your stack to now just one piece in green here at about 3 o'clock on the clock. And so, it doesn't mean that web content management is unimportant. We're spending half an hour of our time here talking about it, and it is an important selection for you, but it needs to fit within your larger architecture. And in particular, it's going to need to be more of an order taker going forward, where some of the personalization, orchestration, customer data, operations and planning, intelligence, and even in some cases, core enterprise content is going to be coming from further back within the enterprise. And your web content management system is going to be really about sort of assembling some of this information and contextualizing it and then putting it in front of some customers in some channels. So it's a different sort of scope for WCM. And not all the WCM vendors have really kind of cottoned or accepted this new world of what's going on. And the biggest mistake we think you can make is to pick a WCM vendor that's still in the 2000s or still in the 2010s in terms of the way that what they assume about where they are in your stack. Then you have other vendors. I'll pick on Sitecore here, but this could be Salesforce, Adobe, Acquia, many others, who will purport to sell you in one or two platforms, all of this kind of stuff. And if you're a small or mid-sized business, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're a large enterprise, what this means in many cases is you're getting worse to breed. So, this is not necessarily an answer to the stack complexity problem. This is a vendor trying to say, okay, WCM is now a small piece of it. I'm going to expand into all these other areas. And that's not really the right way to build your stack. So what's happening is what we're calling the great pause. And I think this has been going on for the last 2 or 3 years. And when we talk to some of the more savvier enterprise buyers out there, they're really trying to right-size their WCM investments relative to their other digital needs, including things like outbound marketing, right? Like, what's the relative weight? And in particular, is our public marketing website, is that really where people are coming to? Maybe they're coming more to applications. Maybe we're engaging with them in other channels. Is the WCM really the key vehicle for us to get to people? At some level, certainly table stakes, but again, it's around really right-sizing. And I think there's greater scrutiny of costs relative to inbound marketing and particularly complicated personalization schemes. And what's also happening then on the other side, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is that the web content management mid-market can now do 80% of what the major, more sophisticated players can do. So you're at this time where you're thinking about, I'm using this big name established WCM vendor. Is that really the right size for my stack? Many of our subscribers are beginning to ask that question, and some of them are answering no. So if you're looking at, major players like Adobe, Acquia, Sitecore, Episerver now, Optimizely, you should also be looking at simpler solutions that might actually fit better into your stack. Okay, so now I'm showing you, so basically, you want to think about WCM in the context of your MARTECH stack and think about maybe a simpler solution that's going to be a better fit and play more nicely with some of your other investments. But now I showed you some logos, so let's talk about the marketplace. It is a highly fragmented marketplace, which is analyst speak for there's a hell of a lot of WCM vendors out there, but it's evolving as well. So we cover about 30 vendors. We group them into categories, and that helps kind of make our lives a little bit easier. But also, we often encourage you to look across categories as well. So, there's limited utility to this, particularly because the market is squeezing just a little bit. Having said that, there's definitely, like any mature technology marketplace, the best way to look at this is the complexity spectrum. So we're not making value judgments here. All we're saying is that the further you go to the left, the more richness and extensibility there is, but there's also more complexity, more developer intensity, and more long-term cost of ownership. Whereas if you go to the right, it becomes a little bit less rich, a little bit less extensible, but certainly simpler and cheaper and easier. You can disregard the legacy box in the lower left. Those are primarily systems that you leave rather than you license afresh, but that still gives you at least 24 plausible choices. We don't purport to cover all the 200 to 2,000 different web CMS tools that are out there. These are the ones that our subscribers, who tend to be larger enterprises, tell us that they'd like to understand better. So this is what our customers are telling us they'd like to know. And so these are the vendors that we cover in our research. So it's a broad market. And I have to say that Forrester and Gartner and others really miss the breadth of this market. They focus too much on name players. And the reality is that the market share is spread really quite widely. The other thing to note is that platform as a service is really much more prevalent than multi-tenant software as a service. In other words, with some exceptions, these tend to be single tenant platforms that either you manage or somebody manages for you in the cloud. There's a lot of competition in this marketplace, and that's been good for you, the customer. That's also been good for innovation. There's a lot of competition around usability, around supporting different types of editorial models, certainly competition on architecture. We think there's the emergence of what we call the head optional as the dominant model. So you should certainly think about avoiding a pure play headless solution, as it may not solve all of your different use cases. But then significantly for you, there's been a general market squeeze where the market in general has been kind of pushing upward. And this has put a squeeze on some of the top players, and this has helped give you a lot more choices and also help sort of moderate pricing to some extent. And it's also pushed the Adobes and Sitecore's and Acquia's and others to go into other marketplaces, make purchases in adjacent marketplaces as a way of growing at a time when it's been tougher and tougher for them to differentiate on their web content management capabilities. That's the marketplace as a whole. Wanted to just circle back on this whole sort of headless versus hybrid. I think a lot of you on the call probably understand the difference between a traditional CMS, which not just manages your content, but manages the front-end experience, typically in a web context, as opposed to a headless CMS, which provides a content API, and then you build whatever the front-end experience is. So headless is attractive, obviously, for multi-channel use cases, but the problem is that it turns your front end into an application all the time. And in some cases, you do want your CMS to manage your front end experience for more traditional sorts of websites. So we think that the model is more the hybrid model where I can both be a page editor where it's needed and then be a content editor and only a content editor when that's needed. And we think this is really emerging as sort of like the dominant model, and something to keep in mind going forward, particularly if you're a larger enterprise with really diverse use cases. Okay, wanted to remind you that there's the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you have any questions, if there's anything you disagree with, if there's any anecdotes you want to share, anything you do agree with, feel free to chime in there. Just type it in there, and for sure we'll have time to get to that towards the end. Okay, so now, among these 30, how do you get from 30 to 1? The right fit for you. Again, it's not the best CMS, it's the right fit for you. And we're really big believers in design thinking. And over the last 20 years in helping people select WCM platforms, we've come up with a particular methodology, which we've encapsulated in this book, The Right Way to Select Technology, published by Rosenfeld Media. And the idea is to, rather than traditional kind of waterfall type approaches, you apply design thinking to a more agile-ish, I would say, methodology. So it's business-focused, team-based, it's empirical and test-based. So that's really important, right? You're going to test these solutions against your use cases. It's iterative, so you filter your way down. And then it's adaptive. So you learn a little bit more about your requirements along the way, and you hone them and shape them and refine them as you learn more. This leads to much better selections and typically much faster deployments as well. So what does this mean as a practical matter? As a practical matter, we like to show this sort of inverted triangle using the 5 different canonical states for design thinking, which is empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping, and testing. So as you begin to empathize, the key thing you want to do is create user stories. So you're still maybe thinking about 30 vendors, so you've got 30 plus vendors in the bucket, but the first thing you do rather than research the marketplace is create user stories. These should be the core of any solicitation or tender that you do, and certainly the way that you then discriminate against the vendors. Then you create a broader RFP and vendor shortlist. Using those stories, you can filter down to hopefully 6 to 8 vendors, then potentially go down to 4 from there in terms of then you review proposals and demos. The demos should be your user stories, not the vendor's user stories. Then always, always, always do a hands-on bake-off with 2 vendors for the final phase. By this point, you know your requirements really well. The key thing is to get hands-on with the tools. I'm dumbfounded by the number of enterprises that will essentially let the dealer drive the car around the parking lot and not get behind the wheel themselves. You can definitely get behind the wheel of your web content management system. And then maybe do some optional testing, particularly around security, performance, integration, just to be sure for sure you've got the right solution. Then typically you can get to market much faster because you made a really good decision, you've negotiated a good deal, your team as a whole really understands what it is that you bought. So you can use this really for any marketing technology, but we found it worked particularly well for web content management technology. Let's talk about a couple of these points here. One is, you want testable narratives. So these have real people, real personas pursuing specific objectives. You don't want these sort of checklist RFPs. The vendors have seen them all. They can check all the boxes. The key thing is not so much what the system does, but how does it work? And how do people, your coworkers who have to use the platform and your customers who have to use websites and web applications driven by the platform, what is their human experience, right? And hopefully coming out of the pandemic, we're all focused now on what is the human experience of digital. So you create these scenarios. Certainly this is what we do when we're evaluating the tools. We create canonical scenarios and then we evaluate the vendors against them. And then that way our subscribers can come to a much better shortlist based on which scenarios do the vendors perform better or worse at. So you create scenarios and those become the heart and soul of your tender or your RFP. But then, as I mentioned, you always want to do a bake-off round. And for a WCM platform, typically that's about 3 to 5 days where the vendor's training you and then going through like a week-long sprint where you're actually using the platform. Any vendor who says that they don't want to do this or won't do this with you, you don't want to license their technology because you're for sure not really going to fully understand what it is that you're licensing until you get hands-on. So don't skip this step. All right. Let's get to a couple of key takeaways here then, and then we'll definitely have some time for your questions or your comments. So the first takeaway is that Real Story Group can definitely help you along this path. There's 3 different ways that we help our subscribers. The first one is licensing a research stream. So you can just license our WCM research stream, gets you access to the Real Quadrant Generator where you plug in your own scenarios and your own weightings, and then it generates a custom quadrant for you showing which 4 to 6 to 8 vendors you should target, along with all the backing detail and analysis that you need to share with your peers and get an internal consensus around, yeah, these are the pros and cons of the different vendors. The Story Group has validated that. We're, of course, available by phone and email to help you along that path. So about half of our subscribers choose that option. There's a second option for MARTECH stack leaders where you subscribe to all of our research. It's a full stack package. You get access to all of our research, all of our advisory papers, substantially more time from us to help you make better decisions about your overall stack. So it's not just what's the right WCM fit, but where is WCM going to fit in relative to the other services you might be investing, for example, personalization platforms. Then there's a third option, which is to also join our council. This is only available to enterprise MARTECH stack leaders, meet several times a year in person, then remotely, and then we're going to be doing it in person again, where we can, it's a more of a peer-driven private council where people can share experiences with different vendors, what are best practices, operational models. It's just been wonderful experience sharing among your peers or among MARTECH staff leaders what's working and what's not working out there. Now, in terms of selecting web content management package, 6 things you want to keep in mind. First, the WCM marketplace is fragmented, which means you have a lot of choices. That's likely to remain fragmented, we think, for the rest of the decade. But it's compressing in as much as from the middle to the top of the market, there's not as much functional difference between the vendors. And so I would say it's a little bit crowded. But the good news is that many mid-market, what we used to call kind of mid-market solutions, we now call them mid-range solutions, can satisfy a lot of large enterprise use cases. So that's a good story. There are some cautions around the bottom of the market, which we no longer even really cover, where you've got a lot of site builders like Squarespace that are just fine. And then some cautions around the top of the market, Tridian, which was recently sold, Sitecore and Adobe, that those platforms have potentially excessive technical debt and are proving in many cases too complicated for the more lightweight engagement tiers of the 2020s. We also think that the top of the market is a little bit overstretched horizontally. In other words, it's kind of forcing you to commit to some of their adjacent tooling when, for most of you, a more best-of-breed solution is going to prove a better fit. With respect to actually picking a WCM tool, you want to apply design thinking to your selection if you want solutions that will really work for your team. So the key thing about design thinking is that it's using your stories, your personas. You're learning a lot around it. It's all relevant to what you're doing. It's a very human-based exercise, and ultimately it's a hands-on process. You should remain cautious about headless only. So headless is definitely a useful architecture to think about, but you want to be careful about not having a headless only web content management solution, because in a larger enterprise, you're going to have some use cases that headless doesn't match well, and then you end up having two different WCM platforms, when now there's a variety of, in fact, the predominant emerging architecture is head optional, and we think that's where the market is going. And for most of you, not all of you, but for most of you, that's probably where you want to go too. And then finally, and this is really critical for those of you who have kind of a broader MARTECH remit, you want to select in the context of your broader stack and understand that going forward, key services are likely to reside elsewhere. In other words, outside of your WCM platform and probably from a different vendor. And that includes things like digital asset management, certainly customer data management, personalization, certainly email and any outbound marketing, social publishing. All these sorts of things are becoming very specialized domains. And so in many cases, they're going to be done better by a solution outside, adjacent, or underneath your web content management platform. And so your web content management platform is going to need to integrate with these solutions and not get in their way. And so we think the future of WCM is really going to be much lighter weight. And that's a good news story, I think, for a lot of you, because lighter weight generally means easier and less expensive and more adaptive as well. So on that happy note, I'll invite you once again to ask any questions that you might have around selecting WCM or other technology or what's going on in the marketplace. And while we're taking a look at those questions or comments as they come in, Scott, you want to just tell us about next steps?
Absolutely. And for those of you who are in the process of evaluating a web content management vendor, you can actually have direct access to Tony and the rest of our analysts if you do subscribe in that research area. So certainly recommend taking a look at a sample of our research from web content management or any other areas we cover if you're taking a more holistic look at your MARTECH stack. I also want to mention that anytime you want to take a look at the tools that we offer to get to that short list, such as our real quadrant generator or real-time vendor comparison tool, just let me know at the explore@realstorygroup.com email address, and be happy to set up a behind-the-scenes tour for you of the subscriber experience. With that, I'll turn things back over to Tony, see if any questions have come in on your side.
Yeah, so the first one is from Hiram, and Hiram is asking, how can the IT and marketing disciplines work together to get this accomplished? You know, that's a great question. And, you know, we mentioned that this was team-based. It really should be interdepartmental. We'll argue that marketing or whoever is the business lead should also chair the selection committee. So the first thing we want to do is impanel a selection committee of anywhere from, say, 8 to 12 people. That committee should be broad-based in terms of the makeup. You definitely want a business chair. You want a dedicated project manager. Then you may need some diverse input from IT, including developers, certainly an enterprise architect, maybe a systems architect, maybe a security person, and then across marketing, of course, you may need campaign marketing, certainly editorial, and other managerial stakeholders, so that the people who actually would be asked to use this system or customize this platform are all involved in a group effort. We found this to be a very, very successful model. Also, one of the use cases that you have, you know, let's say you're going to have 5 use cases, like we just helped someone with a WCM RFP yesterday, had 5 use cases. 4 of them were marketing oriented. The 5th one was actually an IT use case where there were some developers who had to create a new component, and how would they do that, and really make sure that their needs were understood as well. So long as there's test cases in your solicitation that address all the key stakeholders around the table on your selection team, and that bodes well for everyone cooperating together, and it helps you get a real 360 view of the platform. So the next question is from Elizabetta, and she is asking about Microsoft and Microsoft as a legacy provider. That's right. I mean, we say legacy because, at least as far as you know, public websites are concerned, Microsoft really doesn't have a story, particularly since they kind of pulled the plug on SharePoint as an external-facing platform. You can still use SharePoint to some extent to do some intranet type things, but even Microsoft will tell you that, there's intranet itself is kind of a larger story in the Office stack. And so, with respect to web publishing, particularly public web publishing, Microsoft really doesn't have a story anymore. There's not really anything in the Dynamics group there as well. And so, Microsoft has partnered with Adobe and sometimes Sitecore and others. Microsoft itself internally uses a whole panoply of different solutions for this. And so Microsoft is kind of AWOL on this. I can't say that you totally blame them. It's not a huge market, but I think they also got burned a little bit with SharePoint and the miserable experience that many of their licensees had with SharePoint as a public web publishing platform, and that just didn't work out for them. Let's see. The next question is from James, and James is asking about Adobe, and is it an advantage that AEM comes with a digital asset management platform? Well, AEM comes with a lot of different things. Optionally, you can license AEM assets, which is the Adobe DAM. It is extra. It typically costs extra. It's actually a separate platform, although it is integrated with the WCM to some extent. It's actually, in our DAM research, we find it's actually a somewhat weak offering. And so that's sometimes a surprise to people who expected, because Adobe WCM is far and away the most complex and richest WCM on the market. And the DAM itself is sometimes a little weak and a little bit of an anchor on that platform at some level, but you certainly don't need to use their DAM, and many Adobe licensees don't. I think the broader question that you have with Adobe and with Salesforce and with Acquia, who inherited the IBM and stack, and with Oracle is, if I go with a vendor and I purchase a lot of their adjacent tools, I'm not at that point necessarily getting the best fit for what I need, particularly since many of these tools are acquired. And in many cases, they're no better integrated than the alternative. And so, we tend to argue against building your stack on the back of a single vendor. Can you give a brief comment on the long-term viability of OpenText WCM as a platform, specifically TeamSite and LiveSite? So LiveSite is the sort of dynamic delivery front end that Interwoven acquired some years ago to go with TeamSite. So what we have said about TeamSite, it was dead 10 years ago, and it's been undead for the last 10 years. In other words, it's hardly seen any significant R&D, has been bypassed in the marketplace. The typical OpenText licensee, in fact, almost the ubiquitous TeamSite licensee, is unhappy with the platform, has been unhappy some time. It's just been such that typically so heavily customized, it's not the easiest platform to leave. And it has, I will say, had some durability in the marketplace, but it's not something that you license afresh. It's just something that you leave, and it's just a question of when. And so, over the last 15 years, really, I can think of maybe 24 times where we have counseled TeamSite separation agreements, let's just say, where we've helped enterprises figure out what's the next step beyond TeamSite. TeamSite is definitely a circa 1990s WCM platform, and still fundamentally is in terms of its core architecture. It had its heyday in the early 2000s, according to that reference model that you saw, and has been in long-term decline since then. Okay, so with that, we've run over by about 5 minutes. Thanks for joining with us and sticking late. As Scott mentioned, you'll get a copy of the deck, and those of you who are subscribers will get a copy of the recording. And it was definitely a pleasure spending some time with you. If you've got more questions about web content management and where it fits in your stack, feel free to email us at or contact us at the coordinates above, and we'll be back in touch. So for Scott Dill and Tony Byrne at Real Story Group, so long now. Bye.